So Trin, at the panel, you basically said, hey, India is wasting money on semiconductors or semiconductor policy. Why did you say that?
Well, first, I didn't say India is wasting money. I'm saying that, of course, semiconductor is very important. It's an intermediate. It's the most valuable intermediate. It goes into everything that we use. And of course, it's an essential if you want to develop electronics, right? Because you do want to have that in India. Ambition to that is very commendable. I do think that beyond semiconductor, there should be greater emphasis for across industries in manufacturing. While semiconductor is very important and it should be emphasized, we should also have emphasis on other sectors as well. That is labor intensive and so on and so forth. Because India, as you know, does very well in ICT already, right? So India has ICT export services. And even in manufacturing ICT, it's the one area that's growing quite well. And then thanks to the government support, right? If you look at every budget, they have lower import duties and so on and so forth. If you look at the budget for the PLI, production-linked incentives, that's a sector that's prioritized, both semiconductor and also electronics, auto, pharmaceutical, and so on and so forth. But that sector in itself is limited in ability to absorb people. Correct. So it's a high value item, but it doesn't fully take it into other comparative advantage that India has. And I do think that beyond, so in addition to, I didn't say don't erase it, that the government should also emphasize other manufacturing sectors.
So as you know, the PLI scheme, the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, doesn't actually cover some semiconductors.
I know.
The semiconductor mission is separate from the PLI scheme. So my understanding is that actually the core of the reason why we decided to spend money on semiconductors, and as you correctly said, it's about $2.5 billion, it's very expensive to subsidize semicon, is largely over supply chain concerns, that the disruptions that Indian auto industry, electronic appliances faced in the chip problems that followed the COVID years. The game was that you focus on chips, roughly 20 to 70 nanometer, not really high-tech stuff, so to ensure that your domestic industry never faces that disruption. Like auto is the single largest industry in the country. So the game is focused on that. But they've only done 3 fabs. I mean, maybe 1 or 2 more may come up. But it's really been more about testing, packaging, the really easier stuff, which are more labor intensive as well, right? And what the deal we've got with Taiwan, we have a 10-year understanding with them now, or I think it's now its 2nd year, is that they will train our technicians to be fab technicians. So now we begin a process of hopefully thousands of Indians going to Taiwan in a 6-year training program to become the fab tech manpower of the future. Because in their view, all of the big 4 in fab tech manpower are aging. And that's where India should go in. But yes, it's not all that labor intensive, but fundamentally my sense is semicon is really, India's semicon mission is partly, I won't deny, because everybody is screaming semicon is very important. I meet the Taiwanese regularly and they said even Rwanda wants to build semicon, and that's not really feasible given Rwanda's economic base. But what we see is you're really looking at supply chain security for your core industries. The PLI schemes, as you correctly said, are scattered. Electronics are doing well. I mean, I think in electronics and in a couple of other areas. Where you're right, I think the PLI scheme may consider, but this is actually one of the interesting problems, is textiles, labor intensive, an industry India's had both cultural and other capacities. But what's been interesting is that we have to compete against Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, who have had massive devaluations of their currency. India rode out the sort of post-COVID Ukraine war inflation problems, but the rupee remained reasonably stable. In fact, very stable. It's actually only the Hong Kong dollar has been less volatile than us in this region. But the result is that we've lost massive currency competitiveness against all of these countries who do textiles as well as not better than us.
I think the issue I would say yes, the currency is one. Obviously, the RBI has been helping by accumulating reserves and letting the rupee basically be much weaker than it should be, right? Because now it's a country that has 1 year worth of reserves, so no longer fragile, very, very, very robust from a macroeconomic perspective. I think the challenge with a sector like textile is multifold. If you compare it to, say, the like of Bangladesh, one is market access. India needs better market access in terms of tariffs to major economies. The second, of course, is, I think, scale, right?
Yes.
So textile, as you know, it's labor intensive, but you also need scale because it's one where it's very, very low profit margins. It's really the volume and you're competing. And here is where I think India faces a lot of challenge, right? India labor market law is very stringent. Modi has done a good job in raising the threshold involving the government to 300, but the reality on the ground is that it hasn't been implemented across the states.
Correct.
Even at the 10 people level, the state intervenes. And so I do think the challenge here, and you can see that in the result, right? So we can discuss which law, what should we do, but reality is most of the firms are very tiny in size. So when you have a country that has 900 million able-bodied, and within the labor force, roughly 600 million people working in the labor force, and the firm size cannot scale, then you're not really fully taking advantage of your comparative advantage, which is scale, right? When people talk about India, it's scale. And of course, there's like here and there is a monthly cost in there, but really that cost of the monthly input isn't the only cost, right? The inputs production comes from economies of scales, electricity, land, how easy it is to, so there are many areas of cost. And I do think that the RBI is doing whatever it can to keep the rupee competitive already. It's only in recent years where it's very, very stable, right? So every year, if you look in the past 10 years, it depreciates a few percentage per year. So it does try to keep it competitive. But I think the real area to target for India that's going to make a huge difference, and it's not just about exporting, but just to have Indians consuming their own goods, right? Because India is a large market and it has a huge trade deficit with China and many countries. So as a result, you can actually plug that gap, right? By plugging the trade deficit without even having to grow outward, it's already in itself creating a lot of value. And the reason why Indian firms are not competitive is they're not able to scale, right? They're not incentivized to scale by the system. And I think that's an area that every government has tried to address. But perhaps the framing of the issue is the problem, right? The framing of the issue, in my opinion, here is people think that they need to be protected, rather than we should protect people by expanding the opportunity, the employment opportunity, the formal opportunity of everyone. And I think this is where of course, targeting sectors like semiconductor and so on and so forth is very important. But really, at the root of the problem is that how do we allow Indian companies to scale, right? Indian people are entrepreneurial, as you know, they do very well in the global settings. So it's not the challenge here. And they do very well in sectors that are not shackled by this. So therefore, I think that is a big question, and the rupee is not the fundamental problem here. If that were the case, we can just depreciate the rupee, which has been depreciating over the years. If you chart a graph, then you would gain global market share, right? But the rupee, in my opinion, is not what's holding India back.
I agree. I mean, I think we're looking at, as you mentioned, several factor reforms that are needed, of which I think you've emphasized that labor reform is the most important. And as you know, in India's federal structure, it's the state governments that have to implement and pass their legislation. The central government can only issue a model bill, which it's done. But that's, I think right now, only 21 out of 28 Indian states have agreed to the new labor code. But if we can get a few more, I think the government will probably go ahead. But I think the other side of that is you're going to see, I mean, besides that, India has tried to become a lot more efficient in terms of logistics and infrastructure. We've seen a definite improvement. Still got a while to go, I think, especially in multimodal transport structures. Single mode, it's actually quite efficient now. And things like the GST, the goods and service tax nationwide, has also eased a lot of the sort of reduced internal transaction costs, lower corporate taxes. But labor is politically the most difficult, and that's partly where I think they're stuck.
Why do you think it's so difficult?
Because it's a federal structure. The states have to agree.
And
Central
why are they not incentivized? Why are they not incentivized to loosen it?
Because they think that is politically difficult to do. In other words, so the states, the view is, you're telling me that I have to break the power, essentially take on labor unions, or anger workers who are nervous about job security issues, in return for economic gains that probably will not occur within the 5-year election cycle. So this is backloaded benefit for me as a politician. So I will just stay away from these reforms.
But maybe I can position a different way, right? So if you look at India formalization ratio, people put an estimate 10 to 12%.
Correct.
That's roughly a labor market size of 600 million. We're talking about roughly 70 million people formalized. So you are protecting such a small share of the labor market and a small
Indian
share of
economists call it the labor aristocracy.
total population, total
True.
working age population, while every year you have graduates coming out. Roughly you need to generate 10 millions of jobs. Youth unemployment is high. Why is it that it's difficult, if this is a democracy where people vote and people should vote with their wallet and feet, why is it difficult to get the buy-ins, right? Because if the share of the people that are benefiting from the protection is so small compared to the people that are outside of protection, why haven't we gotten them to agree with this and the politicians say, listen, this is actually good for my political career, that I allow more spaces to open up?
And that's exactly a standard political economy problem, because those who have the benefit right now are politically highly mobilized.
Right.
And so they have a real reason to get out on the street and fight to save that. The people who are going to potentially benefit don't understand that because they're not trained economically, if you wish. So for them, they are basically passive. It's like the economist Jagdish Bhagwati, an Indian-American trade economist, used to say, the problem with free trade is that the benefit is essentially dispersed across the entire population, i.e. lower and better quality goods. Nobody mobilizes in favor of free trade, though everybody benefits. But the people who get hurt by free trade, protected industries, their hurt is definite, and they mobilize and lobby really hard to protect it. So the political system responds to the highly mobilized segment, but the dispersed passive groups politically doesn't matter, because they're not going to vote on this because they don't know about it, right? So that has been an issue, and that's one of the things that has been, I think, a continuing problem, which is many ways.
But norms do change.
They do change, but they don't change with that argument. They change by diverting the voters' attention to something else.
Right.
Which is one of the reasons it's often right-wing parties are the ones who support free trade the most, because they get their vote support not on the basis of the trade policy, but because of identity politics or other reasons, which is why you tend to have the marriage of classical liberal free market economics with right-wing nativist politics. So this is true even in the United States. When Clinton tried to pass NAFTA, it was the Republicans who voted in favor. His own party, most of them didn't vote in favor of NAFTA.
What about the people that own these farms? Do they come together to organize to improve?
So you mean the ones in the informal sector?
No, the owners of firms, right? They have been incentivized to unshackle the regulations.
Well, no, I would argue quite the opposite. If you are in a firm that is thriving on protection, then the last thing you want to do is to see, you mean the ones who want to grow. Again, for them, it's a notional gain. And if you're a company who has 10 employees, you don't really sit down. There must be a handful of them who are thinking, yes, I could become the next GE or a giant manufacture. But the bulk of them, like maybe if I can go from 10 to 15 people, that's good enough. So again, vast number, I don't think see this as an abstract economic theory, which they don't really, doesn't fit into the reality of which they face. But anyway, I think that we'll see. I think we will see, however, changes in the labor code in the next 1 year. But it will not be based on making the sale to the people who benefit. It'll be based because the political system will have other reasons to get those votes.
Well, if India wants to move the rural workers out of unproductive farming, and it would need to provide jobs, and the only way it can provide jobs is for the private sector to take up more capex, right? And at the moment, they're not incentivized. So, for example, if you look at the latest GDP, one of the reasons it underperforms, obviously there are elections and so on and so forth, but it's just that the government is taking a step back a bit, right? It's stepping back in terms of spending and capex, and it's done a great job in infrastructure. But really, the private sector firms that need to step up, and you still haven't seen that,
Yeah.
right? And I think one of the complaints that government officials tend to make is that we've done everything we can to unshackle it. Why haven't you done capex? And I would say that there is disincentivization of scaling up in India, right? So as a result, because the cost to move up a bit more, but in the longer term, that translates to continuation of low formalization of the labor market, and the fact that people are quite discontent.
Correct. No, I mean, you have effectively a trap here, or you want is a virtuous cycle of companies, as you said, scaling up, employing more people, those people then spending more money because they have higher income, and then that spurs further private capex. And then you get a virtuous cycle of that taking off, in which the government then doesn't have to keep priming the pump, which is a limit to how much they can do that, given the fiscal constraints that India face, any government in India will face. And that's what they would really like to see. Mm-hmm. But that depends on being able to sell a set of reforms that would genuinely be unpopular. But I think what we are starting to see, and I think when you get to the incentive side, the so-called Finance Commission, if you look at the new Finance Commission, which distributes the tax revenue in India, as you may know, the bulk of tax revenue, central and state, is put into a pool, and the Finance Commission then divides it among redistributes among state and center. They've introduced incentives in that if you want more or less, you'll get more or less money if you carry out certain reforms. And so they're trying at least that carrot is there. They're also putting penalties if you don't carry out certain reforms. But I think the biggest story that's slowly happening in India and hopefully really takes off, we're seeing this in about a cluster of maybe 10 states, is increasing competition among states to attract manufacturing companies who obviously will gravitate towards a state which has more market-friendly labor.
So, which is essentially what happened in China, where the provinces are
began
competing with each other. Growth.
But right now you're seeing maybe 7 or 8 states really getting into that competition. A lot of the others are not getting themselves involved so far. But hopefully, yes, that will pick up over time. But yes, otherwise, I think that's one element of it. And then, for me at least, the question of tariffs would follow from this rather than be the beginning of the process. You had stressed the importance of tariffs. In my view, until you get the
tariffs, on what?
In terms of, you mentioned about getting more involved in free trade agreements and so on, yeah. I think the Indian government's view is right now, free trade agreements that give China greater access to the Indian market will just blow away whatever India has already accomplished. So that is a reform that comes after the other reforms come in.
So which areas which country is India targeting to have free trade agreement? So not joining RCEP is an argument to say that opening that up would open up to
So which is one
China.
of the
Then what about bilateral?
So the Persian Gulf is the single largest export market for India right now, trading area. So we've done it with the UAE, and now we're working, I believe, negotiating the Gulf Cooperation Council, which basically brings in Saudi Arabia. We have a smaller FTA with Oman, but that's part will eventually be merged. We're close to one. We've done one with EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, but that's basically, I think, the idea is to slowly build that towards a UK FTA.
What about the EU FTA?
And that after that comes the EU, because
Right.
the EU is the most difficult organization, trade body to have an FTA with.
Right.
But once you get EFTA, you get the UK, then it's much easier to basically set the parameters for an EU one. The head of Niti Aayog, the government think tank, has called upon us to look at CPTPP. And he has said that, look, if what we've done with Australia, what we've done with the Gulf, for example, incorporating an investment guarantee scheme, what we're doing with the EU, all of these are slowly pushing us in the direction of CPTPP. And the big one I think we're really looking forward to seeing is whether we get one with the United States.
Right.
And if the signaling from Trump's team is anything to go by, that's what Trump wants from India. But it'll be what's interesting is, I think, in trade policy now, is a lot of this is now being merged with technology.
Right.
So if you look at the Trump 1.0, Lighthizer, when he was USTR, had asked the Indian government, yes, we're hitting you with tariffs, as we are with everybody else, but what we're seeing this is the beginning of a process, it's just Trump's way of doing this, for an FTA agreement. But the core of the FTA will not be blueberries and stuff like that, which is fine, we have that as well. It'll be about things like cross-border data flow, data standards, e-commerce. These are the things we want.
Well, India and the US already have linkages via services, naturally.
They do, but they do not have, they are not bound by these yet. Right now it's more of a B2B understanding. So the game is that, can we do this in a more coherent structure? But my understanding is that they want to expand this now to many other technologies. Because
Well, if you look at the chip subsidies, right, within that component, it's about sharing more knowledge with like-minded allies. So today we talk about Japan and India for chips. What about India and the US?
And in fact, that's happening.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the Quad meetings and the bilaterals that come out of the Quad, for example, America in the last in the sidelines of the Quad Summit in Wilmington, Delaware, agreed to a so-called military chip agreement where an Indian startup would be building at Pentagon specifications chips for the U.S. Space Force. So very unusual given India is not a military ally. But here is Pentagon saying, you make chips for us, specifically only for our military, at the cutting edge of our military capacity. And we're starting to see the Americans move into these various other areas. The 19 Taiwanese companies have come to India, and when I've asked some of them, I said, why are you here? I don't think we're really ready for your technology. They said, Washington told us to come. This is geopolitics at work, and so we're coming. I mean, Kavlan whiskey is not one of the high-tech ones, but that's one of the popular ones too. But we're starting to see that taking place, especially with the United States. Japan is a little bit more conservative, I think, on that front, at least in terms of the idea of subsidizing or pushing it into India. But definitely the Americans and the Taiwanese are.
Well, speaking of manufacturing and defense, I think one of the areas where I think manufacturing has a role is not just on the development of a country in terms of GDP per capita and so on and so forth, but it's on the security sphere, right? Because in Asia, we only have a few countries that are self-sufficient in manufacturing defense, right? What do you think about that in terms of the government emphasis?
So, as you probably know, I mean, I think in India's India manufactured almost nothing in defense. I mean, whatever else, a lot of what we did was just assembled from overseas. I mean, some of the things like army boots used to be imported at one point. Now, at least, we're doing the basics, and I think in some areas like artillery, we're starting to see genuine domestic Indian competitiveness. Your really big problem will be really advanced platforms, the missiles, the airplanes, and so on and so forth. Now, as you know, in defense, the specifications in defense industry are the toughest in the world. I think only space comes close in terms of manufacturing requirements. And that's been difficult for India because you need, and defense requires huge capital requirements, right? You can often go for years without a contract. You can be competing with only 5 other companies, and governments tend to buy bulk. They'll buy 100 fighters, and then not buy any more fighters for 5 years. In India, it can be even worse, 10 years. So very few companies are prepared to go down that path because it's massively capital intensive, technologically very difficult, no guarantee of a contract. And India for a long time didn't allow arms exports. So we're starting to see that take place. Partly by reasonably aggressive offset policy that requires that even a foreign company find partners. When you talk to foreign defense companies, they said, our problem fundamentally gets to the issue of scale. You have a very few companies that actually can handle a $50 billion contract to build to the specifications of a Western fighter aircraft company. That's slowly building up, and if you look at the figures, I'd say defense is spreading quite, it's now spreading, and a lot of companies, and I have smaller Indian companies, say at least we're starting to get some money out of this, which we never used to before. But you're still looking at maybe 10 companies big enough to even absorb getting a Boeing, Lockheed, or a Rafale. That's a base that's only starting to take off. What is impressive, however, is space. We're seeing a huge number of startups there. And that is very quad-driven because you're now seeing the international space sector split into 2, a Russia-China one, and then there's the Artemis Accord signatories, of which India is one. So, for example, America's new future space pods will have 1 seat for an Indian astronaut preserved there that's now required. And that's where one area you're seeing civilian technologies and finance, everything come together. And you don't have as many, should we say, restrictions on technology as you have in the defense space. And India has one other problem in defense. It will not be a military ally of any country. And that tends to put a legal restriction in a lot of countries.
Right.
So America recently granted India GE jet engine technology. But they had to change, I believe, 3,000 regulations to do that. Because they said, our system is, you're a military ally, you get this. You're not a military ally, there's a unique space only for India. Only one country fits that. So we have to change a huge mountain of laws and regulations to get you guys to get that.
So when you look at the relationships that India is trying to build to grow outward, what are the countries that you think are most important in terms of emphasis? So today we have the Japan-India conference where investment and trade has grown, right? Exports to India has grown for Japan, and so is investment, but from a low base, so there's a lot of room to grow. So what other areas, countries? So
you're talking in terms of technology or just generally anything? Generally
trade relationship that
you
think that India will want to emphasize?
So I think the game for India is that you're looking, as one of our ministers once told me, we're not looking this in terms of a trade policy. We're looking this, if you wish, as a supply chain policy. That the purpose of an FTA today is about supply chain shift. So you have to combine tariffs, trade, market access with investment, preferably some labor mobility, maybe IPR and technology. And this cluster of policies is now the heart of the new FTAs India is signing. So you do one with EFTA, for example. EFTA commits to, each of them, the 2 big members, Norway and Switzerland, commit to $50 billion in FDI into India over 20 years. But they also agree to a labor mobility. India concedes an IPR thing in return, and then you have the trade and tariff. But it's almost like a side thought to this. You're doing the same thing now. We're trying to rework the one in Japan to more or less mimic that. And as I said, I think the future of the American one, if it comes together, is going to be a big trade, technology, investment, and maybe even immigration in one big block combined together. And the idea is this facilitates not just the movement of goods, but the movement of investment, goods, people, technology in one lump sum. And that, I think, is where you're seeing. So it's basically with the West.
Right.
That's where you're seeing the shift strongest. The Gulf countries were doing it. It's a bit of trade, immigration, and investment. but it's less integrated maybe because they're not as technologically or they don't have the corporate structures that the West does, if you want.
But when you talk about supply chains, currently, there is the bulk of a lot of the supply chains are Southeast Asia plus India, North Asia, right? There's a lot of greater linkages between them. So how does India look into that, right? Because obviously you're also concerned that you don't want it to be an open back door for rerouting, but at the same time, you cannot devise a supply chain strategy with total disregard to your neighbors.
Well, Southeast Asia, I don't think India has that much of a problem. India's problem is with China, and this is the big issue that India will have to. We'll see how that goes geopolitically, and partly that's one of the things I think the Trump administration policies will be important at. As has been mentioned, you see the connector countries, China basically doing tariff jumping by switching its supply chain via Southeast Asia and Mexico and so on. This is not a problem for India because India has a huge restrictions on Chinese FDI. So we trade with China, but we don't get Chinese investment because India doesn't allow it, right? Or they puts massive restrictions on it. So we're not a connector country, or we are at a very small level. So, but if, for example, Trump imposes tariffs on connector countries, as he's threatening to do, and he goes after, let's say, Vietnam, and says, this isn't Vietnamese product, you're just reshipping Chinese stuff, so tariffs come into play. The question then, and that's what you're already seeing companies saying, if this happens, then India makes much more sense to us than Southeast Asia, because we come to a country that doesn't get into this connector problem. Right. And if you combine that with an FTA within the United States, then you've got a perfect fit, as long as India then does enough domestic reforms to make it worth it. So if I'm correct, there was a report in the press that said, Apple said, if Trump is going to impose tariffs on China and goes after these countries, at present we plan to scale up iPhone assembly and manufacture in India to roughly 25% of all iPhones by 2027. If these things come in, we're going to have to take it to 37, maybe 40%, right? And Google Pixel and the others have also arrived in India one by one already, but they're looking at these tariffs and say, if this happens, then making India then becomes more and more competitive as a place to do business. Electronics, I think, is the one area we're having reasonable success. And you can see like Corning Ware is building a Gorilla Glass factory because there's enough demand. We're seeing, I think Zeiss of Germany building a lens because of the demand here. A bunch of other smaller component companies are arriving. But what I think is going to be the bigger issue, and this goes back to this technology agreement, a lot of what we're looking at, these phones and so on, are going to be future AI platforms. They're not going to be this basic algorithm app that we have right now. What we'll start to see if people are, I'm not the expert, but people who are say, what we're going to start to see is this happens, the AI world is going to split. There are going to be some types of AI that America will say that from China we will not allow and vice versa. At which point the present mobility you get with an iPhone in any part of the world starts to shrink. In which case, where do you build your AI platform? Especially if China is going to say, no, that AI platforms aren't going to be allowed to integrate into our digital structure and vice versa. Again, then India becomes competitive. Southeast Asian countries, in my view, who've been trying really hard to stay neutral in all of this, that we can play both the US and China market at the same time, they're going to start to have to make a tough decision.
Right, in the AI sphere, it's very energy hungry, right?
Yes.
So I think one of the things that the Modi government has done well is to really just expand energy source, right, into renewable and so on and so forth. But relative to the per capita, India per capita energy consumption supply is still very small.
Yeah.
So how do you see that energy policy moving forward for India? And the second thing is that when we talk about energy and the generation of electricity, then we have to talk about the distribution, which is the grid, right? And I think that's another area of investment that's needed. And then there is the sense right? The Indian government does want to stay out of where it doesn't need to stay in business, except for essential sectors. It does want to fiscally consolidate. The Modi government won the election but lost majority. So there is some concessions to be made. So in that slicing and dicing, how do you see this shaping up for what India wants to do, which is AI? And for example, a country that's much more energy rich is Malaysia, right? It's net surplus of energy that is very competitive. And so how do you see India positioning itself in the future?
So I think a couple of points. On the AI side, yes, well, almost anything in data now is going to be energy intensive. And it's a huge problem in India because of baseload power. Green baseload power is proving very difficult. Because solar plus storage was the original plan. Storage right now is too expensive. Batteries, you have X number of minerals, and the batteries are largely going to EVs. And so battery costs are too high. So that is an issue, and I don't think India right now has a solution, whether it's going to be LNG plus sequestration. They're re-looking at nuclear. India is building nuclear, but
actually
I think
that was going to be my follow-up question.
But small modular is still a while away, and that would be the best way to handle it. So the perfect idea would be data center, AI development plant, and a nuclear reactor attached to it, right? A cluster that works on that front. But an SMR is still at least 10 years minimum away. The big reactors are expensive and very slow to make. I think we're second only to China in the number of reactors we're building, but we're really far behind. So that is an issue that has yet to be resolved. And right now we're just using fossil fuel. Though some kind of a solar solution is potentially there. My sense, though, in a country like Malaysia or even a Vietnam, their problem is more about the AI manpower base is very small. At least when I've talked to companies, they said there's a limit to how much AI we can do in a country like Malaysia. There are not enough Malays who are really into the skilled labor force at the highest level, a bit on the small side for us. And I think even if you look at what we're looking at, I think NASSCOM, our Indian Software Chamber of Commerce said, let's not get down the LLM path right now. That is wildly expensive, wildly energy intensive. But there are a whole bunch of, should we say, apps or products that will lie on that or ride on those LLMs. That's where India can go down. That's easier, more labor intensive, brain intensive, not so energy intensive as developing these giant LLM. Let somebody else do that. And that's because we have a trust factor with America that allows us to ride on their LLMs. Let them do the hard stuff or the really expensive stuff. We'll do the other stuff. Maybe at some future time, as you said, we resolve the energy issue, then we can go down there.
So we talked about labor, which there's a lot of unshackling to do. There's energy. Finally, land, right? Land, I think urban land is very expensive, which makes sense in a country where a lot of people relative to land. What is India going to do about this land problem that we have to do mass scale manufacturing?
So I think land is under the federal structure a state subject. The government has tried once before to make land acquisition easier and failed politically in 2015. And right now I don't think they have a genuine solution to make what I would call a genuine land market yet. I mean, they're trying to work it out with using, for example, digital mapping technology so you can delineate actual ownership in a tighter way rather than right now, which ends up in endless court battles of where exactly is my property and your property. But right now what's happening in the state governments at least is they're taking up their own land. They're buying up wasteland and so on and building so-called land banks and saying that we'll just give you the land as an industry and then building industrial parks and so on. The policy that's been tried now, it seems a bit more stable, if you wish, and better. But yeah, it's a problem because under Indian law, eminent domain functions only in certain areas like railways, defense, 6 or 7 areas. But if you want to just build a software park, it doesn't come under eminent domain. And so again, it's the states going to have to become more competitive. We're starting to see that happen, that the states that get it right get the manufacturing or the other kinds of investments, even IT parks. But now, state governments, and you go to them, they're building up those land banks. It's not a perfect solution, but that's the best we can do.